Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and today I've got a classic movie-inspired video for you. A client of mine asked if I was willing to paint a print that he had already printed out himself. Of course, I said yes. In a few days, I had the element stones from Fifth Element arrive on my doorstep. Thankfully, I don't have to be a perfect being to get these stones ready to stop the impending darkness. Also, I have a special request from all of you, so be sure to watch to the end, because I'm sure one of you has the answer I'm looking for. Now, since my multipass is up to date, I'm going to grab my brushes. Let's get started. Before I can start painting, I had to prep the surface of the stones. Unfortunately, my video on this was lost, so I hope some pictures will do. Since they were made on an FDM printer, they had very noticeable layer lines. So first I painted on a couple of layers of UV resin and cured them. Using resin like this allows me to skip a majority of the sanding that they needed. Ultimately, this not only eliminated the layer lines, but also filled in the seam that each one of them had. I followed this up with a quick primer coat, and for that, I'm using Styrylrez Gray. Since I used UV resin on this, it was important to get good coverage so that they would be safer to handle. Now that they were primed, I started with a base coat using German Camo Black Brown. While this step is very straightforward, there are a few key things that I had to take care of. Most importantly, I had to make sure the insides of all the cracks were well covered, as this color would be my darkest tone. And since I had 4 stones to base, I wanted to make sure all the cracks were done first, just in case I ran out of this paint. And it was a good thing I did this, because I did end up running out just as I finished basing the final stone. Thankfully, since I was going to be using many highlight layers on top of this, getting good coverage on the flat areas wasn't really a top priority. So long as there was a bit of color covering all of the gray, full coverage was not necessary. So any patchiness you see is not a problem. In fact, it'll add to it by adding a subtle variance to the overall look. Before I moved on to any of the colors, I wanted to add some physical texture with sterling mud. This technical paint has tiny silica pellets mixed in that once dry will give a natural cut rock surface. Again, like before, my main concern was to make sure that the cracks were well textured first, as there were still some layer line textures that survived the resin coating. Beyond the cracks, I tried adding this randomly across the surface to help hide the slightly raised areas that remained from filling the large seam that each stone had. Now, a word of caution, you're going to want to use an old brush when you use this paint, because it is absolutely punishing to the brush. As the grains of silica work their way into the bristle, your brush will fray and spread out. That's why I'm using this old AK brush. It's one of the oldest brushes I have. In fact, it's taken more abuse than I thought it could handle. By the time I finished this texture step, it was looking pretty rough, so much so that I thought of retiring it. But instead, I figured from the years of service, it should be rewarded. And the best way I can think of doing that is by giving it a name. So that's what I'm going to ask of you, my fellow artists. What name do you think this brush has earned? Be sure to write your suggestion in the comments below. The Macho threw out the idea of Siegfried. It kind of sounds magical and knightly at the same time, but I want to hear from all of you too. Speaking of the Macho, it's a good time to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. With it being one of the most direct ways you can support the channel, I cannot thank you enough for doing so. If you would like to join the Painting Pantheon, there'll be a link to the Patreon in the description below. And before we get back to the stones, I'd like to wish a special friend of mine a speedy recovery. He has been key in encouraging me to make these videos and develop my channel. And while I'm filming this, he's most likely going to be in surgery and probably won't see this until he's well into recovery. It may not be much, but I'm focusing all my good vibes and sending them your way, brother. Now back to the stones. For the highlight layers, I grabbed a handful of my brown and beige tones. After looking them over, I decided on leather brown, burnt flesh, khaki, and skeletal bone in that order. First up, leather brown. So to apply this, I used a sponge stippling technique using a cut piece of kitchen sponge. This lets me put a random spotty pattern down without agonizing over it, but there are a few things to know about this technique. First, be sure to know it takes a lot of paint when using a sponge like this, because unlike a brush, the paint will soak up into the interior of the sponge like crazy. So you'll want to plan ahead for this and make sure you have plenty of color. Or if you have it available, you can use a piece of dense foam to substitute for the sponge. They are less absorbent, so more of your paint will end up on your model instead of drying on the sponge. Now, I wanted this layer to cover roughly 80 to 90% of the base coat, so I went a bit heavy. Once I hit that amount of coverage, I moved on to the burnt flesh. This color added a nice warmness to the stone that I was looking for. It leads me to my second tip with this technique. When you do this, be sure that you're dabbing straight down and lifting straight up. Any movement across the surface will ruin this stipple effect. In the early layers, this smearing won't affect the overall look too badly, but as you move to the final layers, it can mar the look fairly quickly. So try to imagine that you're using a stamp while doing this, straight down and straight up. Next up, khaki. Since I was getting closer to the final layer, it was important to lighten my touch here, which leads me to my next tip. Similar to a dry brush, the first few times you touch the model after loading your sponge will be the heaviest application. So it's important to have the first stamp to be as light as you can make it and in a place you want the most color. As your sponge dries, you'll have to press harder and harder to get an imprint. But you could use this to your advantage by feathering the edges of the heavier prints. So be sure not to reload your sponge until you really want to. Finally, skeletal bone was our last sponge highlight. Since this was the last color, I made sure to dab all of the edges to give each stone a slight edge highlight. This will help the edges stand out when they're facing the observer and be well defined to the eye. And as a final tip for this technique, when pressing, be sure to press evenly across the surface of multiple fingers, not just your fingertips. Too much pressure on a small area like a fingertip will cause any paint in the sponge to be gushed out, leaving an unnaturally looking round spot. So keep this in mind and spread the pressure evenly and not too hard. While the stones look good at this point, they're still a bit dark compared to our reference photo. To address this, I took them over to the spray booth. I thinned down some of my final highlight of skeletal bone to create a glaze. Spraying this from a further distance than I normally would use puts a nice tan filter over the stones. This normalized them to a neutral tone without completely losing all of the stippling work I did earlier. Also, I wanted to make sure this didn't get too much into the deep cracks, so I used a high spray angle in relation to the stones. This way, not only were my deepest shadows well protected, but any spray that did get in would simulate a natural overhead light source. This had the extra bonus of getting subtle highlights to the surface texture without even trying. So, double win. And with that, the elemental stones were complete. While I know to some, the idea of painting what is essentially a rock isn't too exciting, doing exercises like this is important because you will be faced with natural surfaces like this all the time in this hobby. I think I've painted some kind of stone over a dozen times already for this channel. And unlike my previous rocks, you don't always get the luxury to let the surface of the model do the work for you by using dry brushing. Sometimes, like here, you'll have to build up both a physical and a simulated texture using just paint. Unfortunately, I don't have an STL link for this file as of yet because it was sent to me already printed, but if I do find it, I'll add it to the description below. If you liked this video or found it helpful, maybe think about hitting that sub button. I just crossed 300 and I can't wait to hit my next milestone. With your help, I think we can get there in no time. Also, don't forget to toss down an idea for my veteran brush. Should it be Siegfried or can you come up with something better? I can't wait to hear your suggestions. I'll be sure to let you all know what name I picked in the next video. For now, this isn't goodbye so much as see you next time. And as always, artists, thank you for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.